Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual book launch of So for the Record, Behind the Headlines in an Era of State Capture by Anton Harber. My name is Jennifer Malik. I'm the editor of the Reading List, and we're hosting this launch tonight along with Jonathan Bull Publishers and Love Books, your favorite independent bookstore. In conversation with Anton Harber this evening is Jacques Pauw. Jacques is a journalist, author, and documentary filmmaker. He was a founder member of the anti-apartheid Afrikaans newspaper Vrye Weekblad in the late 1980s, and he's won numerous awards over the years for his journalism. He's the author of 6 books, most recently the best-selling exposé, The President's Keepers. I'm sure you'll remember that book. Our featured author this evening, Anton Harber, in the middle, was a founding co-editor of the Weekly Mail, later known as the Mail and Guardian. He was the chair of the Conference of Editors in 1991, the National Association of Broadcasters in 1998, and the Freedom of Expression Institute in 2010. He serves on the board of directors of the Global Investigative Journalism Network and the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism, and is an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of the Witwatersrand, a columnist for Business Day, and the co-editor or author of 5 books. The book we're launching tonight, So for the Record, Behind the Headlines in an Era of State Capture, is the result of dozens of interviews with politicians, journalists, policemen, and deep throats. And it centers around 2 tales that reveal the lows and highs of journalism during an era of state capture. The book is out now from Jonathan Bull Publishers, and it's available for purchase at Love Books, who are co-hosts this evening, for 280 Rand. If you're in Joburg, you can drop by Love Books in Melville to pick up your copy. But the Love Books also deliver countrywide, so with a small fee depending on where you are. So you can email Love Books at orders@lovebooks.co.za, or you can visit their website, which I think is lovebooks.co.za, to order your copy. And I suggest if you haven't done that yet, you can do that now while you're watching. We also have an excerpt from the book up on the reading list, so if you'd like to dip into it while you're listening, that's at readinglist.click. That's the website URL, readinglist.click. Wherever you're watching this, please leave your questions in the comments. I think is somebody watching the YouTube live stream at the same time as, if you could close that tab, I think it's interfering with the sound a little bit. Thank you. Please leave your questions about the book in the comment section wherever you're watching. And Anton will have time to answer some of those questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Jacques and Anton and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hi, Anton.
Hi, Jacques.
I want to start tonight not with the meat in the book. I want to start with your writing style, in fact. You know, when I spoke at the journalism conference on Tuesday, I stressed the importance of quality writing in a book of investigative journalism, which this is. And I was fascinated by your writing style because you don't follow, and I don't quite know how to put it, but you don't follow sort of like a linear kind of narrative. In that you move from one subject to the other. You interweave the different subjects, and you interweave with your own expertise and with your own analysis, and then in the end, you bring everything together again. It's a fascinating and a beautiful writing style. And what is interesting is that you acknowledge the Wits MA creative writing class in your book. So what was their role, and how did you decide on this style of writing? Because I think it is fascinating.
So when I set out to write it, I felt I was facing a number of challenges. I was determined to write a book about the South African media, but not an academic book. I'm at the university, I'm in an academic atmosphere, but I wanted it for a wider audience. And I really wanted it to be readable. I mean, I think that we really have to work hard to make investigative journalism as readable as possible by as wide an audience as possible, and use the tools of narrative writing to do so. And then I had the idea that one way to push myself was to join the creative writing masters class. And in that you share your work with other writers and aspirant writers and a fantastic group of supervisors, people like Ivan Vladislavich and Bronwyn Law-Fillion. So they push one to say, come on, you can do this better, try this way, try that way. And it's fantastic to have a group of one's peers to do that. The first time I've ever been in a writing group, and I found it incredibly fruitful.
Let's get to the book itself. Everyone knows that this is a book about the best and the worst of journalism during the state capture era. Now, in this book, you are scathing about a number of journalists. Let's call them a cabal of journalists that enabled state capture. You know most of these journalists on a personal level. I think, in fact, one of them was your student at some point. Was it painful for you to expose this sloppy, incompetent, even unethical journalism by people you actually know?
It certainly was. It's not easy to take on one's peers and one's colleagues and people one's known for a long time, and people I've had some respect for in the past. Yes, it was difficult. I often had to sort of gird my loins and say, no, you've got to say what has to be said. But at the same time, I did say to myself, look, I've known these people for a long time. I've known the Sunday Times for a long time. I, in fact, took part in an earlier internal sort of inquiry at the Sunday Times into some of these problems. So I thought I had a rare perspective on these things. I've been a journalist for 40 years, so I'm just starting to get the hang of
it. You researched and investigated this book for almost 2 years. You spoke to tens of journalists and affected officials. You worked through archives and documents. I think one interview took you a year to set up. Why did you decide this was an important book to write?
Because we have to face up to the crisis of journalism and news media in this country. And the way to do that is to look at the highs and lows in recent years. I think it's absolutely imperative that we scrutinize each other, that we hold each other accountable. We expect accountability of politicians and other people we write about. We accuse them sometimes of having impunity. But we need to be accountable, and we need to hold ourselves accountable. We don't want to be accountable to politicians and judges and people like that. I mean, we are to some extent, but we want to hold ourselves accountable as journalists who care about the work we do and the profession we're in. I think that media self-scrutiny, we used to, the attitude used to be, we mustn't criticize each other. There's a sort of gentleman's agreement that we don't criticize each other. And I think that's wrong. I think we have a political, a social, and a moral imperative to self-criticize. And that can be tough and that can be difficult. But I think it's in this day and age, it's absolutely essential. I try in the book, I'm a great advocate that one way we need to fix journalism is through a transparency. As best we can to show how we do what we do and let people understand what we can or cannot do. And I try in the way I do the book to show people how we do this kind of work.
When you wrote the book, the Sunday Times had already withdrawn their three major investigations. So by the time your book is coming out, we already know how wrong the Sunday Times was in their exposés. Yet you bring a completely new level of understanding of what had happened. Were you surprised about the fault lines in journalism? How badly the journalism was done by the Sunday Times? Did it even surprise you?
It absolutely did. And I knew it. And I knew it from the earlier inquiry. And I'd followed what happened closely. And I had been talking to some of those journalists.
Oh.
But when I took a close look at what they did or didn't do and what evidence some of their allegations were based on, and when I read all the stuff, one after the other, to show how they stuck with their story regardless of what happened, it became increasingly clear to me that it certainly wasn't a series of mistakes, that there was a deep-rooted problem with the culture and the practice and the methodology of journalism in the newspaper. Some of it is tied with things that are happening to all journalists and all media, the financial pressures, the political pressures. But, you know, the question that was in my mind throughout was that the people who were trying to play the Sunday Times, the spies and the tobacco industry and other crooks and no-goodniks, who they were trying to play a lot of the media. They were trying to play you at City Press, but there was something in the Sunday Times let them fall for it. And I wanted to identify what was it, because as journalists, if we're gonna solve a problem, we first have to understand the cause. And I'm hoping that you read the book, you have a deeper understanding of the root of the problem.
You know, you mentioned the so-called state capture journalist, and you speak to most of them. You know, Stefan Hofstadter, Mzilikazi wa Afrika, Piet Rampedi, editor Felicia Oppold, and to a lesser extent Malcolm Rees and Rob Rose. I think it was only Mzilikazi and Piet Rampedi that wouldn't speak to you. What went wrong with these journalists? I mean, there's some point in your book where you write about Wa Afrika and Rampedi and Hofstadter, and you write about how brightly they started their journalism careers, that they were at the forefront of breaking major stories at the Sunday Times. And then came 2011. It started with a rendition story. It went on to the Cato Manor story. Eventually, it went to the SARS Rogue Unit in 2014. What went wrong with these journalists? Why did they fall for it?
Yeah, so one can, and I try to look at it at three levels: the individuals, why they fell for it, why the Sunday Times newsroom enabled it, and the editorial control they enabled it, and then what was happening in the media industry widely that has put all of us under pressure, and particularly traditional newsrooms. So when one comes to the individuals, let me say this. I think that some of them, they were just young and naive and poorly led by their seniors. Some of them, it was ideological. They seemed to buy into the state capture story and project, and Tom Moyani at SARS's view of what was going on. It's also clear that state security agency was drawing on their secret slush funds to pay some journalists. I don't know who, but I think one has to raise the possibility that there's also some journalists who had been corrupted in one way or another.
Well, you speak about Chad Thomas, who performed intelligence duties for the state security agency, and who was the journalism man and had wide contacts in journalism.
Yes, and what I say is when I talked to him about the journalists and what was going on, I was constantly surprised at how much he knew about them and their private lives and their relationships and what was going on in the newsroom. So one has to take on board that there was a systematic attempt to lead the Sunday Times along this path. Some of it was by state security, some of it was by the tobacco industry, some of it was by people like Pandey in Durban, who was going after General Boyson and the Cato Manor story.
Yeah, absolutely. Now,
one of the astounding things, for example, was the Sunday Times people knew that was what Pandey was doing. They knew he had an agenda.
Well,
I mean,
they exposed Panday to start with. Isn't it ironic?
Sorry?
They exposed Panday to start with in
They
earlier
exposed
years.
it. And then they bought what he was selling. Maybe not directly from them, but quite often through third parties.
Yeah. Now, the one journalist who was involved in all three major investigations is Stefan Hofstadter and Mzilikazi wa Afrika, who wouldn't speak to you. But you did speak to Hofstadter, and I think you had various sessions with him. How did he justify what he did and what he wrote?
You know, his argument is that they did good, thorough journalism, and he would think they got some things wrong, but he still argues that they did the investigative fact checking, etc., that they should have. And when you try and tackle things like the story of the SARS brothel and look at how thin the evidence was, I mean, there's a deep incapacity with Stefan to accept the fact that as good a journalist as he was for many years, he had a period in which he messed up badly. Different responses from different journalists. Some are more acknowledging of their errors and mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, at the other extreme is Piet Rampedi, who is still arguing today that, and Mzilikazi, the last time I spoke to him, says, no, they're going to find the brothel and show where the brothel was. And we all know that that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's, you know, we're talking about the journalists, but we mustn't forget about the editors. There's, for example, Felicia Oppold, who was the editor of the Sunday Times during the SARS Rogue Unit reportage. And she was also, or there's strong evidence that she was the person, for example, on the 10th of August 2014, that inserted into the story that Johan van Logrenberg, who was the investigations executive at SARS, that he was an apartheid spy. And in fact, when you asked her whether she did that, she said, well, I might have, but I cannot remember. So what was Felicia's, what was the editor's roles in all of this, in getting the stories into the newspaper? Because there had to be checks and balances, but clearly there wasn't enough.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that you're asking an absolutely key question there. To a large extent, the editor is responsible for checks and balances and practices in the newsroom. And you cite a very good example, because she is at best ambiguous about inserting that wrong fact about van Logrenberg in the first story. And that raises the role of her ex-husband, the strange role of her ex-husband. Yeah. Who I interviewed with him, trying to convince me that he wasn't the source of that information. But I think, as I indicate in the book, both he and Felicia have an obsession with van Logrenberg's background. So I've no doubt that played a big factor, but it's wider than that. And what I do try and do, to be fair, is to try and make clear the kind of pressures that Felicia Oppold was under, that the editor was under. The political and financial pressures were enormous. And that's why it's a question of the culture in the newspaper. There was just a demand for the investigative team to come up with a big story week after week. And that was, and their newsroom could do that when they were a much bigger, much better resourced newspaper in the days when newsrooms were 3 times their current size. But when they shrunk to the way they shrunk in the last 10 years, you're never going to produce a blockbuster front page every week unless you push the boundaries. So that pressure was there, but it was clearly mishandled and not properly managed. A point I make in the book is a question of design, oddly enough. The Sunday Times front page looks the same every day, with a screaming big headline every week, with a screaming big headline across the top. most major newspapers around the world, serious newspapers, and I'm saying ones that see themselves as serious, not just tabloid, they only have a big screaming headline when they've got a big screaming story, and they've got other designs for the front page when it isn't that, just to say, here's the news of the day. The Sunday Times design forces that screaming headline week after week, and when your newsroom is shrunk to, I don't know, a third of its size, you're under huge pressure to produce that story, and the truth is you can't.
Yeah. In fact, you talk a lot in the book about what you call the Sunday Times treatment. And I'm going to read to you how you describe the Sunday Times treatment. There could be only one version. A counter-narrative would only confuse the reader and weaken the story. So the newspaper stuck with its rule. Choose what you believe to be true and go with it. Meaning that there wasn't space in the Sunday Times for any counter-narrative that might prove them wrong. So they were not, and we're going to get to the example now with Cato Manor. They had to believe their own version. They couldn't believe any other version, though it might be true. The Sunday Times treatment.
Can I just read another paragraph that kind of describes it?
Yeah.
Each editor would take out some qualifiers and nuance that might temper the story. The cumulative result was that the story was clear and firm, hard-hitting. It was a style developed over years, and with its efficacy proven in the newspaper's sales figures. But in the process, allegations often became assertions, assertions sometimes became fact, claims became evidence, and evidence became proof.
Yeah.
So there was a series of editors whose job it was to refine the story. And let me say this, because I think it's interesting in the wider context. That attitude comes from 100 years of when the Sunday Times was the biggest, wealthiest, most powerful paper in the country. They used to say, and I recall it irritating me immensely, it's not because I worked on a small newspaper, and they often used to steal our stories, but they would say it's only news when we say it's news. They were big, they were powerful, they were rich, they were arrogant. And they could be because they come from a period when newspapers set the agenda. But what they hadn't realized is that had changed in the last 10 or 15 years. That social media has taken away that power, that gatekeeping power. Now everyone goes round the gate or through the gate or flies over the gate. But they were slow to realize that was the case. So even recently, I've heard them say, it's news when we say it's news. And you know, in the end, it's hubris. And that's what got them.
I want to go back to the Cato Manor story, and I want to go back and I'll try and summarize this. In October 2011, Sunday Times editor Ray Hartley got a phone call from General Johan Boysen, who was the head of the Hawks in KwaZulu-Natal. And Boysen said to him, I hear that your journalists are snooping around. They're going to write a story about one of my units. Ray Hartley kept the story for a week, and he sent Stefan Hofstadter down to Durban to go and speak to Johan Boysen. Now, at that time, the Sunday Times had completed their investigation, and they were preparing questions for the police. So Hofstadter flew to Durban to see Johan Boysen. Mzilikazi wa Afrika joined the meeting on the phone. And this is a crucial meeting between the two journalists and Johan Boysen. Anyway, you then interview Boysen about what was said in this meeting, and he gave you a version, how he tried to convince the journalists that the unit only acted in self-defense and that their killings were justified and whatever. On the other hand, and he said they showed him photographs, and he told them the photographs are wrong and it's only crime scene photographs. Hofstadter gave you a counter version of this. So you had the two versions. And you say in your book, you were now stuck in that you will have to write You will have to reflect both versions, and the reader will have to make up his or her own mind. Then suddenly Boyson said to you one day, but we recorded this meeting. Both me and Hofstadter recorded this meeting. You asked Hofstadter for the tape, and he said, no, the tape is gone. Johan Boyson, who in the meantime had moved from Durban to Pretoria, said his recording is somewhere in a box. Weeks went by, months went by, and then Boyson came out with a tape. What did this tape reveal?
So this is really interesting because I try to take people on the investigative journey. You know, we don't like to say there's this version and there's that version. We want to find out what actually happened. So it was fantastic to suddenly realize there was a recording, but it was hard to get. When I got it, I was completely amazed. I was completely amazed because the recording is quite astounding. Because let me just put it in this context. The one consistent complaint about the Sunday Times in all three stories is that they would approach the subjects of their stories at the last minute. It had become standard practice, and they would just then put in a paragraph or two at the end of the story. So as you say, they'd made up their minds, they had their story. Instead of listening to the other side and taking it in and testing it, they were ticking a box, and they say, okay, we'll just take a paragraph or two and drop it into the story. That was one of the fundamental problems with their journalism. But that conversation I found complete. It was so extraordinary that when I told an American journalist about having found this tape and what was on it, this journalist said to me, you need to check that tape. You know, maybe Boyson's played with the tape. How do you know? And that's when I went to Hofstadter and said, can I have your version? And he couldn't find it. But I mean, some of it was so bizarre. So absolutely, they actually didn't show the photos, but they discussed the photos. And Boyson clearly said to them, be careful with those photos. First of all, they're not what you think they are, because they're absolutely routine crime scene photos. You think they expose a whole lot of things, but they don't. Those are photos from our files, ordinary crime scene photos, and they don't show what you think they show. And Mzilikazi, while Africa, intervenes on the phone from Johannesburg with some of the most bizarre questions that Boyson is just saying, I can't believe what you're asking me. He says things he says, for example, suddenly out of the blue, how often that you've been in the police force that you've seen a man shot in the head at short range? Oh. And Boyson saying, what? You know, what's going on, and where do you get this from? So I think it shows that, you know, unless you do an interview thoroughly and properly, and the problem was they were there just to tick the box, to get a phrase or two, to get the denial. He suddenly says, is it true that these photos were stolen from the commissioner's house in Durban? And Boyson says, you know, I don't know what you're talking about. Where does this come from? It should have raised some red flags for them about their story. But they'd made up their minds and they weren't sharing another story.
Yeah. And what is astonishing is that this interview took place only 2 days before the Sunday Times published their exposé. Now, in this interview, for example, you know, the Sunday Times alleged that Johan Boyson arrived in a helicopter at the scene of a extrajudicial killing, and that he congratulated his members. Boyson said to them he only arrived 90 minutes after the shooting, and they can go and check, and he will help them to get the helicopter logbook that will prove he only arrived 90 minutes later. They didn't take up any of his invitations. But what I found astonishing is that in the interview, Hofstadter said that they had discovered, and this is his words, that they had discovered patterns of police killings that raised concerns. Yet when the Sunday Times came out 2 days later, they were writing about a death squad, assassinations. The unit raises the specter of apartheid's vlakplaas, something completely different to what they said to Boysen they were investigating.
Yes, that's exactly my point. They didn't go to speak to Boysen, to hear his view and assess his view and weigh it up against what they knew. And, you know, one thing you've got to do is put details to the person. Here's what we base this on. We have this information. What is your information? They were going down just to go through the process of hearing the other side, but only as a show. So, yes, you're quite right. They put to him that there were some worrying patterns that had come to their attention. They didn't say to him, look, we think that this was a systematic death unit. They didn't do that. And I think that's a real moral and professional problem.
I quickly want to get to the rendition story. That was also, I think, 2011, and it implicated Hawkshead Anwar Ramat and Gauteng Hawkshead Shadrach Sibiya in murder. Now, you went to interview Shadrach Sibiya, and he sat there and he meticulously showed you the evidence that, number one, that he was never present at the rendition, and secondly, that the rendition, if in fact it did take place, was done by police crime intelligence. This evidence that Sibiya shared with you was the same evidence he had in 2011, and that was in fact given to the Sunday Times. They never published it. They never entertained it. And they implicated Sibiya and Ramat in murder, which eventually led to their demise and the appointment of General Ntlemeza and whatever. Why did the Sunday Times not publish their version of events?
It's because of the Sunday Times treatment. Let me say this first of all. In the first two stories, the Cato Manor Death Squad story and the rendition story, there was a story to investigate.
Yes.
There was. I don't have a problem with them tackling the story. There definitely were human rights issues that needed examination. Just in doing it, they went off the rails. So let one say that. But the Sunday Times treatment was to only have and go with one narrative. They did not want to hear and see the other evidence. They didn't even make a token effort to say, we're going to write a story this week that's, you know, what you can do as a journalist, you can say, here's the counter narrative. Here's the version, and in fact, here's why we think it doesn't hold and why it's not true. Right? They didn't do that. They just pretended it didn't exist. It was appearing in other newspapers. It was being said again and again, and they just ignored it. And so consistently there was evidence. The SARS story is different because I don't know if there was as much of a story to investigate there in the first place. But there they were prepared to accept things like the KPMG report, which when you read it, you think you had to suspend all doubt and all critical function to take this report seriously. It was an appalling job.
If we look at the SARS Rogue Unit report, the first salvo they fired was in August 2014. When they labeled Johan van Lochrenberg as an apartheid spy without any evidence and without asking him for comment. Then came October 2014, when they splashed with SARS-bugged Zuma. And they claimed that just after Zuma's rape trial, which puts it towards the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, that they bugged his house in Forest Hill in Johannesburg. They put it as a fact. When that took place, the so-called rogue unit didn't even exist. When that had taken place, Johan van Lochrenberg, whose photograph was on the front page of the Sunday Times, was not even the head of the unit. He only became the head of the unit in I think April 2008. Yet, sort of like a few weeks later, they followed with SARS ran a brothel. This brothel in Durban. No facts. We don't know where the brothel is. We don't know what happened. No evidence about a brothel. And then on the 6th of November 2014, they reported that Johan van Lockerenberg had made a confession to new SARS Commissioner Tomoyani that there was, in fact, a rogue unit. You saw that memo. There's no mention of a confession in that memo. No. So there was a total of 36 stories over 2 years about the rogue unit. Was this the worst reporting you've ever encountered?
There's no question. Because even if you take the most benign explanation that they started by making errors on these stories, and you have to be really benign to see that, because as you say, the evidence either didn't exist or was so thin, or they just ignored the counter evidence. But on the most benign, okay, the brothel story, you get caught because it sounds very juicy. But it becomes immediately apparent. And there you have Van Lockerenberg and Adrian Lequet and the SARS people saying, where on earth do you get this from? It's just not true. But they just persisted and dug their hole deeper and deeper. Instead of allowing any counter story, they just stuck with their story over years, over, as you say, dozens of stories. It is the most consistently bad journalism I've seen over a period of time. And that it took so long to retract and apologize. A change of editor, years later, it took them to retract and apologize. And that is just extraordinarily bad.
But then, Anton, let's get to the other part of the book. 1,500 kilometers down the road in Cape Town, there was a meeting between Daily Maverick editor Branko Brikic and Amabungani co-head Stefans Brimmer in 2017. This was a game changer, and this is what you call, in contrast, slow, good journalism. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I contrast the Sunday Times fast journalism with the slow journalism of Amabungani as an example. And I did this very deliberately because, you know, while the Sunday Times story is horrifying when you see the details and the extent of it, it's important to emphasize that we also have some great journalism in this country, some really important great journalism that contributed enormously, like your book, to putting the brakes on state capture and ending Jacob Zuma's presidency. It's very important to see both those sides and not to generalize across the media, as so many people do. So I tell the story of Branko meeting Stefans and saying, I've got this extraordinary collection of emails that busts the story open. And Stefans, like, realizing this is a huge moment. And Branko, we all know he's a dramatic, colorful figure. I'm sure he played it up fully. And Stefans, although it's kind of midday, Stefans orders a stiff drink. And
I ordered.
I enjoyed the fact that one of them said it was tequila and one said vodka, because I think it tells you a bit about how you get two versions of a story and you have to struggle to get the right version. Yeah.
What was amazing about the Gupta leaks was the cooperation between Daily Maverick, Amabungani, and News 24. And I mean, Daily Maverick and News 24 are competing titles. Yet they joined forces for the good of the country. Do you think that was a unique and defining moment in our journalism?
Yes and no. I mean, more collaborative journalism is the trend around the world. More collaborative investigative journalism is the trend, because when you get that much data, you need different skills. And you've just seen ICIJ's, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, latest big story, where they worked with 400 journalists across the world. So that is a tendency because of the nature of getting that kind of mass of data on a hard drive. Whereas, you know, in your and my day, we used to hope for a couple of poor photostats and be happy with those. And dealing with that much data really requires very particular skills. But it was very rare for such competitors to come together. And, you know, I think Branko at Daily Maverick must get a lot of credit for seeing, first of all, that this was so big, he didn't have the resources to do it, and he needed to work with Amambogani and share it with them. Even more remarkably, when his biggest rival, I mean, he had a relationship with Amambogani, but then his biggest rival is News 24. And when they come and say, let's work together, he's got the foresight to say, actually, they can bring an audience that's helpful to us all. And he brings them in.
But then, even with the Gupta leaks, there's also betrayal.
Yes.
And enters Lady Macbeth. Tell us about it.
Well, Branko will only call her Lady Macbeth. In his book, he calls her Lady Macbeth. She's the woman, well-known, outspoken, extraordinarily successful businesswoman. I'll name her in a minute. Who was brought in and agreed to help support and give the financial support that the sources would need to protect themselves and to enable the story to happen. What I outline in the book is how it got to the Sunday Times because of her, and while the sources were still in the country and endangered them, and really, I thought behaved extraordinarily towards the people, the journalists who knew what they were doing and who were best able to handle the story. She felt she knew better, and I think there's real questions over her behavior. It was the well-known businesswoman Magda Wierzicki.
Yes, yes.
I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Having interviewed so many journalists that were complicit in state capture, because that is what they were, and that's what you say in your book. Are these people damaged? I mean, people like Hofstadter and Malcolm Rees and people like that. Are they damaged? Are they carrying the burden for what they had done? Can they be rehabilitated?
That's a very good question. Are they damaged on a personal psychological level? I mean, I was very struck by how everyone I spoke to from the Sunday Times in that period talked about how toxic the atmosphere was in the newsroom and how damaged they were. And that includes editors and juniors and all kinds who took part. There was definitely something toxic in that newsroom that damaged a lot of people. So yes, the journalists were damaged. But on the other hand, at least some of them got handsome payouts to go away and have their hands tied what they could say about it. Can they be rehabilitated is a tough question, but certainly if you're not acknowledging that things went wrong, you can't be.
Sure.
And some of them clearly haven't done that and therefore can't be.
Anton, I just got a note that I have to stop because there are loads and loads of questions. So I'm going to give back to Jennifer.
Hi. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions here, so just bear with me while I try to pick out comments from questions and things like that. For example, this must be perhaps a former student, accounting doctor listening, Prof. Proud of you, Stephen Fura. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that surname correctly. Krista says congratulations. Lebogang says she's glad to be attending the launch. So we've got a lot of comments, but I'm going to try and find some actual questions. Someone says they're sad we all can't be at Love Books, and I think we're all feeling the same.
Absolutely.
I think this one should be quite interesting. It's probably going to take up the whole screen. So here we go. Johan van Lorenberg himself has a couple of questions. He says, I have 2 questions for Prof. Harber, if possible, please. And I'll just read them and then I'll remove the comment from the screen so we can see our faces again. Number 1, why is it not front page and constant news that big media houses and journalists were manipulated, coerced, and played by the state capture gang, rogue intelligence operatives, and criminals? I would like to see their replies, explanations, justifications, and deeper digging on this. In the same vein, why are media houses not chasing and following up on this topic as a primary news theme, as it is so relevant to where South Africa is?
It's a very good question. You know, there needs to be closer and further examination of the roles the State Security Agency played. Some of it has come out, but not all of it. And it is something we have to confront and deal with. Look, I think that people are mistakenly saying, you know, we have to move on. We're over state capture. That's, some people argue that. Others are, I think, quite nervous about digging deeply into this phenomenon. But it seems to me that if we are to tackle brown envelope journalism, if we are to tackle the problem of whether or not some journalists have been corrupted themselves, we need this to come out. I mean, I think while the people who did the investigation into this, the State Security Agency did an important and good job, they didn't go deep enough. Their brief was not to go deep enough to say these were the people who were corrupted in the process. And the truth is, we need to know that. So Mr. van Lochenberg asks a very good question. But let's just maybe add.
Sorry?
I was wondering if Jacques wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I can only agree with you, absolutely. You know, the question still remains, because especially if you look at the SARS rogue unit, it wasn't everyday or normal journalism. This was manufactured journalism. There was a hidden agenda behind it. And I think that's what we need to uncover. Who was behind it? You know, the journalists have already said that the intelligence services were amongst their sources. Now, we all know if the intelligence services feed you something, there's a political reason why they're doing it. And I think we need to get to the bottom of it. But there was a question from Pearlie Hubert, which I would love to see.
So the question is, on behalf of Johan Boyson, don't you think Ray Hartley should take more responsibility for allowing a monster to establish itself under his watch?
Pearlie always gets to the story, but I've never heard Pearlie give a sentence like that before without at least one curse word in it. So great to hear you, Pearlie. Editors have to take final responsibility. There's no question. Ray Hartley jumped to the defense of the Cato Manor story years later, distanced himself from the Sunday Times apology and retraction. And I take apart in the book his response to that, because I think I think he gets it wrong. I think he does need to face up to the fact that a story that this happened under his watch. Not all of it happened under his watch, but that particular story definitely happened under his watch.
But Anton, even Felicia Oppold, when you interviewed her, I think she said to you that the brothel story was probably wrong. There was no brothel, but she wouldn't accept the same responsibility for the other stories.
That's true. Although in her last email to me, she seemed to be more contrite. But you're right that she gave me a written statement in which she stood by everything except the brothel story. And that was deeply disturbing. We won't solve these problems in journalism unless we identify them properly and fully. We expect others to not have impunity and to be accountable. We have to be the same.
Well, I think that leads us nicely into the next question from Mohale Malloy, who says, How do we as journalists and editors make sure what happened at the ST does not happen again? What needs to change in the way we do our work? Perhaps you have some
Mahali is
ideas.
a student of mine, I should tell you. So he's probably heard me talk about this before, but let me say briefly that we have to rethink how we do journalism. We have to work on the basis that there are different narratives and conflicting narratives, and it's seldom that there's good and bad, but stories are complex and nuanced, and if you oversimplify them, you run into trouble. You have to remain open-minded to the other side of the story, and you have to constantly say to yourself, getting it right is more important than rushing it into press, because that's often what they did. And we just need a new culture of verification and scrutiny and caution to get it right. And getting it right means accepting stories are complicated, there's competing narratives, and the best stories often have competing narratives, and you've got to deal with both of those.
I think that leads nicely into the next question. We have a lot of people saying, the book is really fantastic and congratulations on the book, and they really love the book. So if you like, we can go onto Facebook or YouTube later and have a look at all the people heaping praise on the book, which should be a nice ego boost after this. But here's a question from Lebogang. Says, can I ask Prof. Harber a question, please? The contrast you make between fast and slow journalism in your book is very interesting and generally a true indication of the Sunday Times and Amabungani, respectively. To what extent would you say that the production of quality journalism is shaped or impacted by business models used in newsrooms? And I think
spot on. What I point to is that part of the problem in the Sunday Times were the financial pressures they were under to produce a blockbuster story every week under conditions where they couldn't, when resources were being cut. What we're seeing now is that some of the most, not all, but some of the most important and interesting work is being done by these new independent, non-profit, grant and philanthropically funded specialist units, Amamugani, Becker Caesar, Oxpeckers. In fact, we're just working on some research to identify these, and we found 25 of them across 15 sub-Saharan African countries. So it's a phenomenon, a new phenomenon. In fact, it's a global phenomenon of philanthropists stepping in to enable non-profit work. And what it also enables is a slower journalism, not driven, because most of them mostly publish on the internet, and not driven by the daily or the weekly deadline, but driven by doing the stories that need to be done and doing them well. I must say, when these units first started to come up, I thought this was a good phenomenon, but not a sustainable one. And we're in this extraordinary, unexpected position where philanthropically funded non-profit journalism is looking more sustainable than the traditional business model. Who would have thought that a few years ago?
Jacques, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm fine. You can go on to the next question.
Okay, cool. Here's a question from Kenichi Serino, who just above says, greetings. I have a couple of questions. Anton, you mentioned the financial and economic pressures put on the Sunday Times to produce big scoops every week amidst dwindling reporting resources. What role did management above the editor have to play in these stories being published and supported?
Very big role. There's no question that that's where the financial pressure, traditionally managers would stand between the shareholders, the owners and shareholders, and the editor and protect that space. But the financial pressures have changed, and that practice has changed. So a big player in my description of what happened in this era is that the CEO was a man called Mike Robertson, a former editor himself. And his relationship with the editors and the pressures that's put on them is described in some detail in the book. I mean, a lot of journalists appreciated the fact that he was an ex-editor, so he understood their position, and he did, and he does care about journalism. But he was the person who had to bring the shareholder management pressure to bear on editors. And I give a description of the kinds of pressures the editors were under that I hope that tries to capture how difficult that job became.
Anthea Garman has a question. Anton, did any of your interviewees express worry about how they were impacting on South African journalism as a whole, its credibility and its standing on society, in our society? It's almost like these questions have been written in order.
Some of them did. I mean, we talked about those who still believe in all or part of the stories they did and haven't accepted their culpability. So not among them, but there are some journalists undoubtedly who grapple with the fact that they had such a negative effect on our journalism and our relationship of trust and credibility with our audience.
In fact, Anton, you were privileged to attend a meeting or meetings that was actually set up by Johan van Lochrenberg with some of the journalists, and you couldn't write about it because it was privileged. But I think you attended a meeting where Malcolm Rees was, or where Stefan Hofstadter was, where van Lochrenberg was taking them through their reporting at what went wrong. What was the impact of those meetings when Hofstadter had to face van Lochrenberg? And I mean, we all know what happened to van Lochrenberg. I mean, he lost his job and he had to create a new life for himself, and many other SARS officials. What impact did that have, for example, on Stefan Hofstadter?
Okay, so as you say, I can talk about the fact that the meetings happened, but I can't really talk about the content. But I can say this. Malcolm Rees showed some contrition in a letter he agreed to release at the end that I think was important.
Yes.
He was at the meeting. Rob Rose was at the meeting, and Rob Rose is one of the most open to admitting, in my experience, where things went wrong.
Yeah.
Van Lochrenberg said after and outside of those meetings to me that he could not budge Hofstadter and he gave up. And you will know Johan van Lochrenberg. He's a most meticulous and persistent person who's obsessed with finding justice for what was done to him over these years, particularly by the Sunday Times.
And to his people.
Yes, and he said in the end he gave up on it. That's one. At least Hofstadter had the decency to sit with him and work through the stories.
Yes.
Mzilikazi and Rampedi would not even meet or talk to him.
Yes.
So we have, we're just about coming up to an hour. I'm not sure, we have a couple more questions. Maybe I can give you one more question and then the two of you can wrap up the conversation. Maybe Jacques has a last point to make or something like that. So let me just go to this question. I think it's quite an interesting one. Peter Dutoy says, to both Anton and Jacques, do you see similar disinformation campaigns, planted stories, and poor editorial judgment playing out in present day, perhaps this past week?
Jacques, I think that question was for you.
Well, I mean, it was so interesting this week when IOL reported that the arrest of Ace Magashule is imminent. Now, that story was written by Sifiso Mshlangu, who was also the political editor of ANN7 at some point. There's no way he would just have sucked it out of his thumb. There was a reason why that story was published in IOL. Whether it was for Magashule to see what the reaction of the NPA is going to be, how far he will be able to take them, I don't know. But certainly it was a planted story, and certainly IOL, and we know today, we know the Sunday Independent. I mean, every time there's an onslaught against Jan Oberholzer or Andre de Ruyter at Eskom, it emerges in IOL. So they certainly continue to play that role. The role that Rampedi and Mzilikazi played at the Sunday Times with the SARS Rogue Unit, they're now playing at the Sunday Independent. So it's amongst us. It continues, and it's not going to stop soon. And it's not going to, unfortunately, it's not going to stop as a result of Anton's book. It will continue.
What do you mean? Look, Jacques is spot on. Jacques is spot on. Until we fully come to terms with what happened and what went wrong, then this will repeat itself. And what happened this week certainly reminded us of that. And there's a few stories I've seen over the last 6 months as I was finishing the book that made me think we still have to deal with this problem. And I just want to emphasize how important it is. We are seeing how disinformation is poisoning the American elections and the American political debate. And we're seeing its potential for poisoning our political debate. The malicious spreading of false information to cause division and hatred and divide our society for selfish political ends. We are seeing that toxic poison in the air. And what we need to counter it is high quality, good, trustworthy, credible journalism. We have to work hard to rebuild that.
Jacques and Anton, do you have any, or maybe Jacques, do you have any closing question or some closing thoughts for us?
Well, what I want to say is that I had the privilege of reading Anton's book, before it even went to print. And I then said that this is the most important book about the media since the coming of democracy. This is a vital book for journalism. It's beautifully written, it's been beautifully published, and I think everybody should read it.
And if you want to read it, you can go to Love Books. Let's just give them another punt. Love Books in Melville, which apparently have some signed copies, so if you get there tomorrow, maybe you can catch yourself a signed copy. You can also check out lovebooks.co.za or email orders@lovebooks.co.za.
It's a great bookshop. Thanks to them. Thanks to you, Jennifer, for hosting tonight. Jacques, thank you for your kind and generous words. It's great to be in conversation with you. Big thanks to Jonathan Ball and his team, his editing and production team. They're great people to work with. So thank you very much. And I've enjoyed the conversation immensely. So thank you, Jacques.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And thanks Jonathan Ball and Love Books and Anton and Jacques. I mean, it was a really fascinating conversation. We had a large number of people watching, and the video will be available to watch on Facebook and YouTube forever, for as long as those two platforms exist. So feel free to share it with your friends and family and journalistic friends and journalistic students and anyone that you think can get something out of the conversation. I think it's a really vital one to think about. And yeah, thank you for joining us. Cheers.
Thank you.